On the Black History Month website, it states, some consider the Bristol bus boycott to have been influential in the passing of the Race Relations Act of 1965, which made racial discrimination unlawful in public places, and the Race Relations Act of 1968, which extended the provisions to employment and housing. It was hugely influential so that many people believed it shaped Bristol into the multicultural and diverse hub that it is today. We're lucky that the boycott event still has first-hand witnesses and participants we can interview to get primary information on the accounts of this event. There are newspaper articles on the event over the months preserved. For example, the Evening Post and the Times were key publishers on the events as they unfolded. There are also websites of information dedicated to the boycott on the internet that were used to create timelines of the event. Roy Hackett, who is the organizer of the boycott in 1963, is still working as an activist today to spread awareness. Initially, Philippa will discuss the background of the Bristol bus boycott of 1963, referencing how racism is still a prominent part in the modern day. Then Daisy researched potential data collection techniques, which Ellie and Philippa will present, focusing on a range of methods that we could employ in our investigation. I will then present Sam's work on data collection, focusing on how we would analyze the data that we collected and further present it. Ellie will examine potential changes that face us if we were to carry out the investigation, especially in the current climate. Overall, this is a hugely interesting part as to why we chose this question, and it's so relevant to the modern issues that interest us within activism.
The Bristol bus boycott of 1963 was key in shaping modern life today as it started the UK civil rights movement looking for racial justice. This began when the Bristol Omnibus Company banned Black people from working on their transport network, which led people such as Roy Hackett to lead a boycott of the buses in the city. At the time, many men and women from the West Indies had migrated to Britain, where even the highly skilled newcomers faced a lack of job opportunities due to racism. The bus company argued that women wouldn't feel safe and that it wasn't possible for white and Black men to work together. This was a reflection of the attitudes at the time in society. The results weren't immediate, as it took 4 months of debating between local and national actors, until finally, in August 1963, the manager Ian Patey stated how the only criteria would be the person's suitability for the job, not to do with race, colour or creed. This was the beginning of legislative change in the UK, as Harold Wilson's government brought in the Race Relations Act of 1965 and 1968, which showed how the boycott led to national changes in discrimination in everyday life. It's important to understand how racism is still a modern day issue. The Black Lives Matter protests in Bristol in particular were brought to the attention of the nation when the Edward Colston statue was pulled down by protesters. Colston was a merchant who made money off of the transatlantic slave trade, yet was also seen as a philanthropist who was charitable towards schools, hospitals, churches that helped create the Bristol we know today. This brought attention back to the conversation of racism and influenced many researchers to delve back into past pivotal Black history moments, such as the boycott of 1963. This investigation would largely require questionnaire-based research within Bristol's population, as it's based largely on personal and public opinion. We would aim to conduct both random sampling to test whether Bristol's present-day population were aware of how it set the benchmark for abolishing discrimination in Britain, as well as stratified sampling within the older population, 60 plus, as they would have been alive at the time of the event. Stratified sampling will introduce a deliberate bias to ensure that the sample addresses the question, for example, the people who remember the boycott firsthand. These results would produce a more representative outcome. We would have to ask a minimum of 30 people, 5 people per age decade, to differentiate whether there are opposing opinions between ages. Another type of data collection to investigate whether the current population is aware of what the boycott incited is random sampling. Samples are chosen at random in order to obtain the least biased results. We may expect differences in age and awareness to investigate whether the knowledge of the boycott is dying out or perhaps being resurfaced in accordance to the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020. However, random sampling may lead to poor representation of the overall population or area, as we would ultimately be limited by time, as we would only be based in Bristol for a limited amount of time.
To improve this, we could potentially conduct a pilot study prior to the main investigation to make sure we don't waste time on site and to determine whether the questions would be sufficient in providing the information we need to answer the question. We would then make any necessary changes and adapt the questionnaire during the actual survey. Another source of data collection we could use is ArcGIS survey app that could be used to record and track data accurately and easily. We could also review data from the Black Lives Matter protest turnouts across the country and see whether they are higher than other UK protests. This data can be compared, and this could mean that the bus boycott has actually made people more racially aware and more likely to protest for civil rights within Bristol specifically. Bristol's history with racial segregation has influenced our modern day conversations over the same topics that have existed for centuries.
Through the primary data we would collect through questionnaires and secondary data collected on BLM protest turnouts, we could come to various conclusions. Firstly, through our random sampling of questionnaires, we get a vivid picture of the public's knowledge and understanding of the Bristol bus boycott, irrespective of their age or other subpopulations in which the population could be portioned. Understanding the general population's knowledge would allow us to then compare it to our stratified sampling questionnaires to examine whether or to what extent there is a difference between the older population and the younger population's knowledge of the boycott. Through analysing this data through relevant statistical techniques such as Pearson's correlation coefficient and the chi-squared test, we could either conclude that the older generation have a more advanced understanding of the bus boycott, or we could conclude that the general public has a better understanding. We could present this information in a multiple of ways, but the best way would probably through a range of graphs that would most likely be quantitative. Therefore, the graphs will be able to easily present the data and also easy to read to interpret without being too difficult. If our analysis concludes that the general population knows more about the bus boycott than the older population, it would present a secondary research question stating, have the recent civil rights movements improved awareness of the Bristol bus boycott? Concerning our secondary data collection regarding the BLM protest turnouts across the country. If we discover that Bristol has a higher turnout in proportion to its population compared to other UK cities, then this would raise further research questions as to whether the Bristol bus boycott has had long-lasting effects in terms of producing a more racially aware citizens who would then be more likely to protest in civil rights movements. This is where our primary data collection could come into play once more, since if we discover that the general public knows as much about the bus boycott as than the older population, it could help to conclude this further research question. We could present our secondary data by using annotated images and annotated documents from things such as newspapers from the time to give people a visual representation of what was happening, but also our interpretation and findings, all on the same document.
Whilst it is important to plan ahead for what data collection, data presentation and resources we will use, it is also important to think about the challenges we could face along the way and how we can mitigate them from happening. From factors such as the weather to time limits, each research project will always face challenges. One example of a challenge we have had to deal with massively within the past year is that we have been in a national lockdown due to the outbreak of a global pandemic, meaning at the moment we couldn't actually go to Bristol to do the research. Therefore, we may be restricted to online resources. This could become a challenge as online resources may be limited and are usually secondary resources and could therefore lack in reliability. So we could have to take time within our research plan to look into the sources in detail and their origin, so that we are happy that the data is reliable and relevant to our research objective. This will allow us to only use information that we know is correct and suitable to our research question. Another challenge we may face along the way is that our data collection techniques. As the Bristol bus boycott took place in 1963, it may be difficult to collect data such as interviews and questionnaires, as I'm not sure everyone will be aware of what actually happened over 50 years ago. Therefore, much of the data may be incorrect as people are unaware and uneducated. To face this challenge, we could ensure that unbiased background information is given to the participants before they answer, so that everyone has a clear understanding of the events which took place in 1963. A third and final challenge we may face in our research could be within our data presentation. Each data presentation method will have its downfalls. Therefore, we have to assess our data to find which of the methods it best suits. For the primary research data in our research, as Dan mentioned, we could use a range of graphs. Some challenges we could face here are that graphs tend to hold back additional information and are therefore fairly vague. They also fail to reveal key assumptions that we may have already made. Therefore, to face this challenge, we could add additional information to the bottom of the graph to help further explain the findings and assumptions from our research. For the secondary research, our best use of data presentation could be annotated photographs and documents. Problems we could face here is that they won't show us any patterns or trends necessarily, and therefore, after analysing all of our data, we should write a conclusion that makes our findings clearer.
To conclude, it's clear to see that the Bristol bus boycott has a correlation in the shaping of the modern world as we know it, with its basis creating strong feelings towards racial degradation. The strong support behind the BLM protest in Bristol is potentially an extension of how the 1963 bus boycott set in motion feelings that still stand firm within the people today. While this is potentially not directly correlated, there are data collection methods, including questionnaire sampling, secondary data examination, and article analysis. Upon collecting this data as an investigative team, we will be able to look for trends and correlations that show us the impact of the 1963 bus boycott, drawing specific inferences from local people's opinions who would have seen the development of racial tensions over time. Challenges will be prominent in the recent COVID-19 pandemic that have seen our movement restricted, which has hugely influenced our ability to collect primary data. Moreover, local knowledge may not have been as in-depth on the topic as everyone would have thought and have hoped for, as it's potentially not a topic that's taught in all educational centres. Furthermore, all of these elements have made the section of this module so intriguing for all of us within the proposed investigation. This project has encompassed modern relations regarding Bristol alongside the rich and in-depth cultural history of this great city. Thank you very much for listening.
Right.